we were growing up, the assumption was that these ancients with their silly ideas, they couldn't understand the world, so they started attributing things to God and to different spiritual forces. But now we're enlightened, we have science, we can explain everything. And here we are on the precipice of huge advances in technology, more in the sense that there's so much uncertainty and so much chaos that can't be explained by simple rational explanations. Right. God knows everything.
Right.
He knows what you're going to do.
Right.
He knows whether you're saved or not, if you're going to heaven. He knows what graces He's going to give you. The other thing is that you don't earn salvation.
Right.
So our Lord says, I chose you, you didn't choose me.
Okay.
AI hallucinations, I keep coming back to that. Where as technology is advancing, it's seeming less like mathematics and more like psychology and biology.
Awesome. All righty, everybody. So welcome to another conversation between A and I. I'm Isaac Hubble, your host, and we have a very special guest today. So normally we're going to be talking with ChatGPT, but today we get to actually talk to a real-life human being, and that is Father Ian VanHeusen from the Catholic Diocese of Raleigh. And we're just excited because he's got a lot of information on the philosophical thought going into how we can possibly understand the new relationship that we're about to have between the artificial world, the AI world, and humans, and how it's going to affect us, our kids, our culture. And so if you want to kind of give yourself an introduction, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. And we wanted to start with prayer, so we'll start
Yes,
with
sir.
prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly Father, grant us the grace to discern your will in all things, to surrender to your providence, to seek truth, and to live according to your law. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
All right.
So it's funny, to start off with a little bit of an introduction. I think when it comes to technology, part of, before you get into something, there's a backstory. And technology, in a strange way, I never really thought of myself as being like a tech person or being technologically inclined until recent events the last 3 to 4 years. But if I look back at my childhood, middle school, high school, technology was always there. And this is something I think that we don't fully understand as Americans. Is one of the things I travel a lot, and we'll come back to that later. But I travel a lot, and America is really known for its technology. And we're kind of sometimes in America like a fish in water. Okay. We don't realize that we're really picking up the culture. So, but with that, going back, there were many things I did with tech from a very young age. Also, I was very much an artist, very interested in the life of the mind, read Karl Marx at a young age. I read Karl Marx in 8th grade.
Holy smokes, man.
Yeah, I joked around.
Gosh, you're way ahead of me. I was watching Indiana Jones.
Well, I don't know if you remember when Rage Against the Machine was big.
Yeah, the
so
band, right?
Yeah, Rage Against the Machine.
My sister listened to them.
Yeah, well, if you look at their album, their one album that was really popular, there was a reading list. Okay. And on that reading list was Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon and Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto.
Oh, wow.
So I actually, we lived at West Point at the time, and I looked those books up in the library. So, which is funny that West Point had all this radical leftist literature. I mean, they had everything.
That's fascinating,
well,
especially with the McCarthy stuff that was just coming out of the 50s. So, when would this have been, the 90s?
Well, yeah, early 90s. I think the thing that most people don't realize is that even back then, it wasn't so much that books were being removed from libraries. A lot of this stuff was available. Okay. It was more about the popular side of things.
I gotcha.
But so with middle school and high school, I was in a very rich environment with technology, with I remember early forms of the internet, and through college. I did a lot with artists and intellectuals. I fell away from the faith from about 18 to about 23. Okay. And
I can relate to that. I didn't really come back to faith until 25 with my daughter being born. So, I lost it around 18. Well, around confirmation time period, I started questioning. So that's interesting.
Well, I would be curious. I would be curious if this lines up a little bit with my experience. When you fell away from the faith, what was the drive? I mean, I think there's always many driving factors, but
I had
how would you
joined
frame it?
the AmeriCorps program. It's like a U.S. Federal Service program. The NCCC. And I had gotten into wildland firefighting through doing that. And somewhere along that, getting introduced to a lot of the liberal thought, the very progressive postmodern thought that was coming out of like California, people I was meeting, older young people. So I was 18, they were 24, 25. And they were really convincing for somebody that doesn't truly know what they're talking about. You know, like I didn't really understand politics. I thought I did. And it was just a cultural shift. And then there was the whole new atheist movement that was on the decline, but I kind of caught the last wind of that, especially like with Richard Dawkins, because of the environmentalism stuff. I got all into science. So this whole like progressive scientism movement that's kind of infiltrated the United States, especially, that pulled me so fast because I was a dinosaur kid. And, you know, at that time, they were calling every Christian a creationist. You know, I didn't realize the depth of intellectual thought in Catholicism. So that's kind of like, I don't know, did that pull you away too? Did the new atheist movement type of thing?
I was never atheist, but I think you hit on something that I don't even think in the Catholic world people know the depths of, for example, Genesis creation, the creation account. There's the kind of creationism that we see in America with Protestantism.
Yeah.
Just doesn't exist in the early church.
Right. And that's where I started reading the church fathers a couple of years ago, and I was like, wait a minute. And they have all the same books in our Bible. Wait a minute. And then I found out about what happened at Trent, you know, where they removed books, not added books. Yeah. And I was like, wait a second. This goes against the whole paradigm of the mythos in the culture. Yeah. So does that make sense? Is that crazy for young people to...
Well, there's layers of stuff. The church fathers, the way they read Genesis, I've been talking about this online a bit, and even in the Catholic world right now, there's really just not a robust understanding of how the church fathers read Genesis.
Right.
It was read within the context of classical thought, and I hate to say, because some people will read these things and say, oh, it's Greco-Roman, but no, it was really just Western thought that people felt like things were true. And the missing key, and this will kind of come up as we get into technology, is metaphysics. Uh-huh. Metaphysics as a field is widely misunderstood. Even when it's taught sometimes in seminary, it's not really taught in an integrated way. Yeah. A metaphysical understanding of reality, and a simple way to explain this, that in modern times, if something is not a material reality,
right,
and even among Christians, people kind of almost view the world as there's things, there's people, there's objects in the world, and then God. And there's really no in between.
There's no divine realm I don't know if you're familiar with like Dr. Michael Heiser's work on like the divine realm and all that stuff. I'm not saying it lines up with Catholic theology entirely, but it's like we're missing this category of there is this unseen non-material world. Is that what you're kind of going at?
Correct. And I would flesh this out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I should add, I don't really read a lot of the secondary literature.
Yeah.
I read a lot of the primary sources. So the classical mind would be, in the Catholic Christian world, would be Dionysius the Areopagite, the divine names, the celestial hierarchy.
Right.
I'm very excited. There's a lot of new work coming out around that I'm going to be promoting about Dionysius or Dionysius.
Oh, yeah. He was real fun about a year ago last summer.
Yeah. So the thing was that the classical view, and this, you see this Plato, Aristotle, you see this discussed in the early church, is that immaterial realities, the fundamental one that most people are aware of, are angels and demons.
Right.
So you have spiritual beings that have an identity. They're not God.
Right.
And they have an independent reality. They're created. They're not eternal. But they don't have physical bodies. And then you start to see in the classical understanding things like ideas, concepts, laws have more, because right now our relationship with most things that are not physical is that they're kind of arbitrary. So laws.
Right.
There is no, in the modern mind, there's no such thing as the natural law. And this is going to kind of, we'll start to bring it in with technology. I ask people to stay with us. These immaterial realities are real.
Right.
And I think this affects everything from economics to technology.
Right.
So one of the unconventional proofs of God's existence, that I started to flesh out. And I didn't formally study computer science, so I would love for computer scientists to poke holes in this.
Yeah.
But the irony is with technology, with computers in particular, we didn't create them from nothing. And that's kind of a loaded way of saying it. We didn't create them from nothing. We discovered them, and we discovered the laws that govern them. But here's a question for an atheist who's completely materialistic.
Right.
Where did those laws exist before the technology?
Right.
We didn't create the laws. They pre-existed.
It's the same concept of what is it? You can even go into actual physics, not just the metaphysics with it, but the actual physics of the nature of things is that if the universe was just, I believe it's like a 10,000th of a degree, tiny, minuscule amount hotter or colder, none of this would even be possible. Yeah. So there is this, substructure to everything. So why wouldn't it include these things? You know what I mean? Like, and it kind of goes on to what I was talking to you about a couple of days ago with the, what is the definition of what is being saved by Christ with all creation? Is all creation a part of God? And, inherently, doesn't that mean then, going off of the Catholic meta-narrative, inherently everything can be used for some form of good or bad, but who determines that? And then we go even higher, and that is basically good and bad done by objective morals through God, correct? Because God is all good. Jesus is all good. So there can't be anything bad associated with it. Does that make sense?
Correct. Yeah. And I think we could flesh that out a bit. But also with creation, the kind of also modern thinking with technology is that creation is doesn't include what humans make.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So what we make, not just what we interact with, but what we make. Okay.
Yeah. And we make this sharp contrast that you see kind of modern man grappling with, because you see different forms of what I'd call primitivism, like a return to simpler times. And I call it like the Amish effect. Normally nobody believes in having zero technology.
Right.
It's just there's a tendency to want to freeze technology at certain points.
Right. Are we moving too fast?
Yeah. And some of those concerns. But now I'm going to draw in what I wanted to start the conversation with on providence and predestination, which is if we see history as primarily being written by God,
right?
God's in charge. And there's some simple points that are going to seem so simple that people poo-poo them, but they're really kind of important theologically. Yeah. God is in charge. God is all powerful. God is good, and God is loving. And of course, we can teach this to a fourth grader, but the full implications of that is incredibly complex. And that's the irony of it. It's so simple that to come to that informed simplicity requires a lot. It takes, because just on a practical level, God has a plan for my life. God has a plan for the world. As we get older, we experience the obvious setbacks of life, the death of a child, horrible injustice, evil in the world. And it's hard to say, how's this in God's plan or how's this a part of his providence?
Right.
And that's the mystery. That's where the full maturity, I was just writing on this, in the end we return to the beginning. I love that line of T.S. Eliot, is the informed simplicity comes by discovering that even in the evil, even in the injustice, God's in charge and God has a plan. So, and what I want to, and we do have free will, so it's a bit of a paradox, but the one thing I would want to start the conversation with that is often missed in a lot of these conversations, it's not like yesterday or in the last 5 years. Actually, AI goes back further, and we'll come back to that.
Right. It's a little bit more complicated than people think. It's not this brand new technology that's just popped up out of nowhere.
Well, a lot of the problems with AI have been well known in the gaming community for like 20 years. Yeah. And we can flesh that out, like NPCs.
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. I played a game called Battlefield 1942 when I was a kid. My dad had me playing that. It was like a war game or whatever it is. But I always remember I asked him, what does AI bots mean? And this was in 1999, 2000. I was probably like 5 or 6 years old. So it's like, wow, it's, I guess, what would you say? Back then it was more of like, programming very simple commands for the little character to follow, and then like it's not your character; it's all in the space of the game. There are little characters that you interact with that can do pre-program motions, but they don't always follow the same loop every time. And that was the basis of the AI back then, really. But now it's something completely different.
Yeah, and I think we can come to that. And that starts to get into the realm of what we're working on, which
Right.
we have non-disclosure agreements, so we're trying to keep close. But the basic thing with AI is it depends on the parameters you set.
Yeah.
It's just, and that's where a lot of the confusion is. The more you open up the parameters, the more, really fascinating stuff happens, like AI hallucinations and all this weird stuff. We'll come back to that in a second. But with this technology, it's not like when the technology came out, God in the sky, and I'm being very crude in my way of putting this, it's not like God in the sky was like, oops, didn't plan that.
Right, right.
Oh, that they got one on me now. I
Right.
wasn't expecting them to do
I
that.
know, what are they doing?
Exactly. So in the big scheme of things, and I talk about this as kind of a analogy of the mountaintop and the valley. Mountaintop is God's perspective, and you see scripture kind of oscillate between these two perspectives. The mountaintop experience is God's in charge, everything's ordered by God, active permissive will, nothing happens by chance, God's in charge. The valley perspective, and we can't take both perspectives simultaneously. The valley perspective is that we have free will, and we're completely responsible for everything we do.
Right. So would you say it's God offers us a plan?
Let's not do this.
Okay.
Every time somebody tries to flesh out the, oh, you mean this? It's like, no, sorry, that's heresy.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's just you have to hold them.
Is that part of the mystery of faith? You would say, is that the whole mystery of we're never going to fully understand?
Well, it's impossible to,
right?
Because we're human, we're not God.
Right.
How can these things that appear? Because the paradox is an apparent contradiction. That's not a contradiction.
Now, is that because we're in a material body? Now, I'm not going into the Gnostic heresy, but will our soul understand it when we get to heaven in a way? Will it be clear, I guess, a lot of the mysteries of faith, will they be clear? Is that revealed through what, Catholic doctrine, or is that revealed through scripture, as the Protestants tend to lean more towards? What is the evidence that will ever be revealed to us, or is it revealed to us ever?
That's a good question. That gets at the heart of my field, which is ascetical and mystical theology. And so the way Aquinas and the saints, all the saints really talk about this, is so we see God in this life and in the life to come. But it's not that to really fully understand God, we'd have to be like God, which is impossible. But we behold. So and there's some precise language that's used in the tradition about this. We see God, but we don't circumscribe God.
Okay.
And that's a good word. Circumscribe is like to wrap your mind around.
Right.
And so this gets at that the way we behold these mysteries is not by our limited human understanding, our rational faculties, but that we actually participate in God's way of knowing, and we behold them in a way that transcends our natural operations.
Okay.
And this actually starts to get at the way the angels see things.
Right. Because they're created beings still too, correct? And demons are created beings.
Correct.
Satan himself is a created being.
Correct.
And that's always the funniest line towards atheists, is that the biggest believer, I think, in all of history is Satan. He wants to be God. So it's like evil has a permissive nature into every single part of it can take something and distort it from being good and used for the good, kind of like with social media. Social media has been so powerful in spreading the gospel, it's not even funny. The gospel's reached everywhere. A prophecy almost has been, I'm not a scholar.
Do you get
what I'm saying?
Yeah, we could talk about social media a little bit too. You're right. It's the basic idea that people go back. People tend to oscillate between two extremes with technology. The high-tech optimists, that technology is going to solve all of humans' problems. This was one of the problems we were facing with the whole crypto blockchain world,
Right.
because there was just this whole view that was being promoted by people who are advancing this technology that this is going to solve all of humanity's problems. And even some of the people I was working with, I felt like some of their views were a little bit naive. They just had a narrow domain, and they saw that this could do a lot of good. They didn't think about the fact it could do a lot of evil, or that, and we'll come back to this, but that things can get better and worse at the same time, which is a key principle. But I did want to mention with social media, I think a lot of the disruptions we've seen, they've really come to fruition in the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of things that happened, especially in the Catholic world, that gained ground was precisely because, people were online and the availability of ideas and technology in a new way. But if you rewind to the 90s, I remember when I was a kid, there was promoting this idea that there was this assumption that with the internet, with more information, more access to ideas, that a lot of problems were going to be solved. Right. And we didn't really anticipate that there'd be this whole new set of problems.
Well, and that kind of goes into the complexity, and then I want to get into predestination, but with complexity theories, so complex systems. One of the things that isn't always taken into account is that we like to think in a Newtonian linear way. So like we think that if we line a cannon up and we shoot it, it'll land in a certain spot because of the maths. And then if you move it just a tiny little bit, it's going to land in about the same spot. That's not how the world operates. The way the world operates is it's kind of like this constantly influxing, spinning around, going back on itself, and then coming back through, and anything can destabilize that. So one of the things I think is interesting that you were talking about with technology solving problems is that you mentioned that it did create problems, but you mentioned some of the people in there that had this hubris almost towards like, oh, we're going to solve everything because we're making these technologies. Was there any faith driving their behavior? Or was it strictly worship of the self, believing that the self could end up solving all these problems and not doing it through God's will, but their own will? Does that make sense?
That makes sense as an archetype of human behavior. On a practical level, people always ask me to intuit the intentions of people. I think of the Bible passage, the human heart is, who can understand the human heart? Torturous. I'm kind of paraphrasing. Yeah. But first of all, going back to providence and predestination, God is driving the boat. So and this is a key biblical concept, even when people have impure motives or are profoundly misguided, it's not like evil's winning. God's using that for his good. The other thing was that I think I think when you take a group, and this kind of comes to my point of the idea of things getting better and worse, I don't think human society and human culture in general is a simple lump sum, things are better or worse, everybody's good or bad. I think if you go into the tech industry and you go into any industry, there's a mixture of people. Right. They're true believers that have this vision of making the world a better place, and it can be profoundly misguided by pride. Right. There are some people who just want to make some money. There's some people who just want a 9-to-5 job and they're just good at this. Right. And there's a mixture of motives. But going back to the whole things getting better and worse, right now in America, for example, or the world, are things getting better or worse? I don't think there's a direct yes or no answer to that. Okay. I mean, we're in North Carolina, so by the grace of God, our geography, our local politics, our economy, life has been pretty good in North Carolina for a while.
Yeah, it's been pretty stable. It's had some ups and downs, but it's been pretty stable internally, while the rest of the country's had a lot of issues.
Yeah, even our ups and downs are. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of this funny little pocket where we have all the amenities of the big cities and the big areas in terms of opportunities and growth. But we also have a very comfortable way of life where it's very easy to own a plot of land, a house. Right. Hopefully the word doesn't get out and everybody.
I know, that's one of my biggest fears. We don't need any more people. Please come if you want to come, but
But it is kind of funny because I've even started to pick up on with North Carolina. I don't think recessions have really. So at the same time, in this country called America, there are parts of the country that are going through these dramatic fluxes. Right. California, for good or for ill, is just, it's always turmoil. Right. New York City. I mean, New York City just seems to go through these dramatic cycles. Yeah. Going back to the 60s.
Oh, right? Even before that, when you go back to the 30s and then you drop it back to, the huge immigration that was starting during like the Restoration period, post-Civil War. It's fascinating to see. There's always been chaos in those areas, and there's nothing that can, it's always positively, it seems, feeding itself. There's no negative pushback on that system. So there does seem like there's a lot of chaos. But there's also, so like, that's where it kind of gets into, like, with predestination. This is what I'm trying to understand, I guess. And my audience also is very curious about this, because a lot of them are Protestant, but they take the, what is it, double predestination
Calvinist
thing. But I've had them ask about the Catholic mode on that. And there's kind of three schools of thought. And I was wondering if you could kind of help flush this out a little bit, because then we can see how it could apply to technology, artificial intelligence, and then cultural response, like the cultural behavior behind it. So there's the Jesuit school of thought, right? Which is Molinism.
Molinism. I'm gonna throw this out there because I've tried to research Molinism.
Yeah.
Right now in contemporary thought, the problem with when people write about Molinism
Yeah.
is the primary works of Molina are not primarily available.
Okay.
Also, the way people spin it, I don't think my intuition, I could be wrong, is they're not really presenting Molina correctly.
Okay.
I actually think Molina's point is a little bit more nuanced than most people understand.
Okay.
Because the debates between the Thomists and the Molinists seem to center around the idea of knowledge.
Right. Right.
And it's a very scholastic point, which is in Aquinas, particularly in Aquinas, and I might be getting this a little bit wrong, the technicalities. And then I'll just explain how I explain things fairly simply to people, is in Aquinas, God's knowledge causes the thing.
Okay.
So, and he fleshes that out. It's a little bit more of a complex point.
Right.
Molina seemed to argue that God's knowledge does not directly cause things.
Okay.
But Molina, I think you would have to hold in the Catholic world that we believe in predestination.
Right. Right.
But we also, at the same time, believe in free will. And that's kind of, so the Calvinists reject free will.
Right, right. They think you're either God's sending you, you were born to go to hell, or you were born to go to heaven, and there's no in between, and there's no actual saving of anybody. Some people are just here, kind of like the non-playable character you could think of, that are programmed, they're going to go to hell because they are strictly in the world and created as a negative entity, you could say, in a way. Like
so this is
something like that?
Yeah, this is where it gets tricky. So, I'll be curious to see how people react to this one. But the Calvinists really collapse metaphysics.
Right, yeah.
So there's this idea in classical thought of primary and secondary causality. So the things, I'll go through what we can affirm.
Okay.
We can affirm that God actually already knows if you're going to heaven or hell.
Okay, so that is a player in this. He knows. So is that like the Mullen?
No. This is just it's actually just the Bible.
Okay, cool. Okay, I wanted to make sure that we were specific. I didn't want people to get confused. Are we talking about 1, 2, or 3? One of the different versions. Okay, sorry.
I think where you start to try to most of the debates are trying to fully expound upon this paradox.
Okay.
And so there's a few statements I'm going to make that seem contradictory.
Okay.
So God knows everything.
Right.
He knows what you're going to do.
Right.
He knows whether you're saved or not, if you're going to heaven. He knows what graces he's going to give you. The other thing is that you don't earn salvation.
Right.
So our Lord says, I chose you, you didn't choose me.
Okay.
And Paul actually has one of the most difficult answers to this. How is it that God chooses some and not others?
Right.
And Paul says in the letter to Romans, who are you to question God?
So nobody knows who's predestined.
Exactly.
Okay.
Of course. But then, this is where it gets tricky. You're completely responsible for everything you do. All your actions, you're completely responsible. You're a free agent.
Right.
To the sense that we assume that you have your faculties.
Okay.
As you start to get into the cases of severe handicaps or mental illness, and that limits culpability.
Right.
But in the ideal, you're fully responsible for your actions, and God is just. So, but also with salvation, God is merciful. You don't earn salvation. So it's not like you're not so wonderful and then God saves you. It's like God saves you and then he transforms you from glory to glory. Okay. And so really if you just have to hold those things in tension.
Okay.
And it's funny, and don't feel bad because everybody, whenever I teach on this, immediately tries to resolve the paradox.
Right. Well, and again, the thing I guess is that it's the not knowing.
Yes.
It's the there's this. I work for a Protestant man, so it's been interesting to see his way of looking at faith because he reminds me a lot of Noah. I mean, this man is praying constantly. And he's a farmer, and he works very closely with the ground and works with a lot of living things. And it's been interesting because his worldview is that it's a choice to be saved, almost a choice on you. And I may be speaking for him. That's why I don't want to name him by name. But and I think that's interesting because what is it? The thief on the cross is saved. And so was he predestined to be saved by God, or was he predestined for that moment?
Okay,
Or do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah.
How do we? Because they seem to have this idea
we
of
could spend a lot of time on this.
Yeah.
I think we're going to need to move on.
Okay, yeah. Sorry.
No, but I'll just repeat.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back and I'm going to say some simple things. You're like,
I can resolve this.
God is in charge.
God's in charge.
Nothing surprises God. He knows what's going to happen.
Okay.
He has a plan for the world.
Okay.
And it's just it's so funny because this is, I think, part of the grappling with these deep truths is you start to well, what about this case or what about that case?
Right.
It's and this is even with technology, because I have to deal in a lot of the tech skepticism and a lot of the tech fear.
Right.
Is people just not trusting that God is in charge, God has a plan.
Right.
Even with end of the world stuff.
Yeah.
The world could end this year. Guys, the world will end exactly when God chooses it for it to end. And he already knows when it's going to end. So this is kind of the trust of faith, which is not to say that I can't commit a sin and I can't go to hell. I mean, we have free will at the same time.
Right.
I'm completely responsible for all my actions. And I hammer this point a lot, and I do think it is the hardest thing to accept. It's, and there's a great work that does it in a very simple way called Abandonment to Divine Providence.
Okay.
By Cusade. Mm-hmm. And there is this mystery that even with the things we do that are sins, after it's done, God knew we would do that. That was the plan.
Right. And basically whatever the outcome is there's your free will, though. You are a free agent to have chosen that. He knows it's kind of like you put the marshmallow on the table. God knows which little kid's going to grab the marshmallow and which one's going to be patient and not. It doesn't mean that either one of them is going to go to hell. That's not the predestined part, you would say. The predestined part
God knows who's going to heaven and hell.
Right. Sorry, let me rephrase that. So it's he knows that one of them is going to grab it and one of them isn't. But that doesn't mean that the one that grabs it is the one that's predestined to hell just because of their behavior. It could be the one that doesn't grab it, that doesn't do the sinful behavior. Would you say that make...
I think this gets at
the mystery of faith. There we go. Okay, so but that helps me understand. So when I ask a question, we're trying
to again, the fundamental problem with this is trying to put God's knowledge in a way that we understand.
That's almost like what maybe we can get into now because this is where it's going to play into the tech thing. This is good
because it's just every time I have this conversation, it's again, you're trying to make God in a way you understand.
Right, you're trying to make him human. You're trying to again, we'd say don't anthropomorphize animal. We can't anthropomorphize God. We're made in the image of God, not God in the image of us. That's such a good point that you bring up. But this kind of leads us into...
Well, with the marshmallow example,
yeah,
God, I mean, first of all, in the big thing, you're talking about one of the classic studies that kids who delay gratification.
Right.
God knows what decision they're going to make.
Right.
He knows why he's allowed it. He knows that it's for the best and whatever the outcome.
Right.
And he already knows, he knows the outcomes.
Right.
He knows every part of it. And yet at the same time, the kids are completely responsible for the act. With kids, it's a little bit difficult because they're not the age of reason, but hypothetically a free agent is.
Right. Well, you can say the same thing for adults too.
But this starts to get at when you're looking at a lot of things. I was just listening to Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers.
Yeah.
when you start to look at a lot of human phenomenon, where wisdom becomes a question is the specialization of knowledge and the advances of different fields
Right.
has made it incredibly difficult to bring it all together. And so for example, why is a person successful? And that's kind of what he's trying to address with outliers. But there's like 20 different variables in different fields.
Right.
Biology, DNA. I always give the example with myself. There was zero chance I was going to play in the NBA with blue jeans. There was just not going to happen.
Yeah.
It didn't matter how
Yeah.
hard I tried, how many opportunities I had. Then there's circumstances, like your parents.
Right.
And you really have no control over your parents or the circumstances in which you're born in.
Right.
Then there are the individual choices you make.
Right.
There's the people that are in your lives, the schools you go to, the teachers, the experiences you have. There's just too many variables. And then we know with like sociology that people work in groups.
Right.
There is a sense of groupthink that groups take on a certain cohesion that we can
Right.
study that.
Right.
And that's the thing to wrap your mind around because we're so individualistic. We don't think of ourselves as part of a group. But by the grace of God, I've been able to travel a lot and I'm in a lot of different contexts. And the more I travel, the more I'm aware of how I'm American.
Right. Okay.
A lot of times Americans don't.
Yeah.
I mean, even because we tend to think of ourselves like the whole diversity thing.
Right.
Oh, this person is African American. This person's
Right.
Asian. This person is Caucasian. This person is Hispanic. But there's a lot more in common than you realize when we've all been raised together.
Right.
Assuming you were raised here.
Right.
That when you go abroad, they see it in us.
Right.
Like they see us all as Americans.
Right.
And that was very striking. Like when I was in Africa, we had an African-American guy with us. And in the mind of the Africans, he wasn't an African. He was an American.
Okay. Yeah.
He was primarily an American.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, so does that mean that culture supersedes the material look? So what doesn't actually exist in nature? So culture doesn't actually exist. We represent it through images and stuff. But
going back to metaphysics, if you take the principle that immaterial realities have a real identity,
right.
like there is a character to being American. And it's not something that can be easily defined. It's not something and that's part of the challenge with philosophy in general.
Right.
There are things that you can kind of see, you have an intuition that exists that can't be defined.
Right.
And definitions are a whole nother thing with philosophy.
Right.
Because, I mean, what do we do with the definition? We take a word, a concept, and then we kind of approximate what it means by adding a whole bunch of other words.
Right. And there's the whole concept of, I was discussing this with my father yesterday on the phone drive here. Freedom, we define it as the ability to do anything you want. But what's interesting is that you can't actually have freedom without a restrictive, superseding structure above it. Because in order to have that freedom, something has to be willing to break whatever possible freedom is in there in order to enforce the freedom. So there isn't technically ever really freedom, which brings us to kind of like the point and purpose of like first principles, which is, are there objective morals that we can't see, but they are objectively there, or is it all relative?
And that's where you get the idea of natural law.
Right.
And
that plays into AI because who's going to program the AI? Is it going to be relatively moralistic or is it going to be objective moralistic? And then where are we getting those objective morals from?
I think this is where some people miss the plot with natural law. Natural law would self-correct.
Okay.
I think this is one of the things with some of the current ideologies. This idea that humanity is like infinitely malleable and that there'll be no concrete outcomes. And the natural law would say if you break the natural law and if you're going against it, your environment will give you very quick feedback. So like let's take out moral law for a second. Let's just say physical law.
Okay.
I mean, you find out pretty quickly about the law of gravity.
Right.
Like, you know, you can bend the law of gravity.
Yeah.
You can use it to your advantage, but you know it's there.
Right.
And we just don't think of moral law the same way. People think of moral law and other principles as kind of arbitrary.
Right.
They don't think that it's, And there's other things that I would say are part of the natural law, like hierarchy.
Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing about the whole push towards egalitarianism and radical equality is that really there is never existed any culture in any civilization that hasn't had some kind of hierarchy.
Right. And that's what I think is interesting about the discussion today. It's very new, because when you read through history, I mean, you can even go back when you're reading, like, I was reading Hesiod a couple months ago for a podcast I was doing on some interesting correlations between Greek gods and demonic behavior. It's totally not contingent to this topic, but what's interesting is that, like, there is a set hierarchy in all these cultures, and the hierarchy seems to mimic human behaviors, except with regard to Jesus. Jesus supersedes all those hierarchies, and basically, because again, the mode of thought was power above power. It's that kind of Foucaultian oppressor-oppressed Marxist view, which is interesting because what Jesus says to do is that, okay, yeah, there are these powers and principalities. Here's how you actually behave towards them. You don't fight them. You show them what Jesus would do. And some of the truth, and that's that truth that's, I think, is interesting about behavior, is that Jesus says, walk the extra mile with the people oppressing you, which is so fascinating about behavior. Like, what is that changed human behavior? I think Tom Holland, the guy who wrote that Dominion book back in 2019, talks about it being a depth charge on all of human society. It never behaved this way. And Jesus kind of breaks the hierarchy, but also reestablishes a new one that we've basically modeled all of Western thought off of. And then you get people like Descartes and Locke and Hume and Marx in the 1800s, these modernist, about to become atheistic, nihilistic thinkers. And I'm wondering, where does that actually come from? Because for almost 1,500 years, there was this mode of imitating Christ. But then all of a sudden that just drops off the plane with this new aged type of philosophical thought where hierarchy doesn't even matter. So where does this idea that we're just going to break hierarchy come from? Do you because I know there's got to be Catholic responses to all these people, right?
That's like getting at the history of Western thought. I mean, I think there's kind of an ebb and a flow. Most people, when they're kind of looking at the modern era, they would start with first the denial of metaphysics.
Yeah, where does that? I guess that's what I'm asking. Where do we start denying the divine?
Well, it wasn't the denying God was kind of like a second, third order effect.
Okay.
William of Ockham was a Catholic priest,
right?
So he denied metaphysics. So he's like, his argument that Occam's razor was the simplest explanation possible, and I think I would not read history, again, going back to providence, I would not read history as, everything was wonderful. The modernists come in, destroy everything. I think sometimes the approach to Descartes, Kant, and others is a little bit limited because there certain things that came about in the modern era that have been good for humanity is one of the things Descartes did, and he was actually, I think he was Catholic and he was a believer, is he isolated the thinking subject. And there's like this kind of focus on the individual and individual consciousness, which I think it's eventually reappropriated.
Okay.
Because if you start, one thing that's missed on us in modern times is certain things that we've just taken for granted
Right.
are relatively new, even in the church world. So John Paul II, as I've delved more into theology, at the time growing up, John Paul II didn't really seem that much of an outlier.
Okay.
But if you read things like Veritatis Splendor, it's a method that is fairly new in the life of the church, which is he does this whole phenomenological thing at the beginning with Veritatis Splendor, where he's getting at the experience. And you see a little bit of that with Augustine's Confessions.
Okay.
But that just wasn't the way, and so there's different aspects that, I think, for example, one of the common phenomenon people have when they first start reading Aquinas Augustine, the patristics, is it doesn't really seem related to everyday experience.
Okay.
Like Gregory of Nyssa.
Yeah.
It seems very abstract, very
Right.
divorced from things.
Very Platonian almost in a way, like
Yeah, that's
it's
That's what people say, yeah.
floaty,
Yeah.
like it's there, but it's not there.
Abstract. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And, but I would say and I think, seeing history as the unfolding of God's providence. So one of the things I've been struck by with modernism and postmodernism, first of all, I think a lot of people attribute the advances in society to the new thinking.
Right, which is not true.
Well, I think on a practical level, the people that move forward in life have certain qualities that are maybe not the full life of virtue,
Right.
but they have character strengths. And character strengths and virtue really come from more conventional morality. So just on a practical level, the great scientist, the great athlete, the great thinker, the great technologist, all of those people, for the most part, not always, are people that can delay gratification.
Right.
They're not obsessed with pleasure. They're willing to forego pleasure. They might have a certain amount of control over their base instincts. I mean, not always, because we know immorality.
We're all sinners. It's just the case.
Well, and we just know a lot of top performers who have crippling immorality with drugs, alcohol, and sex and things like that. But for the most part, a lot of them are able to forego being trapped in a cave of pleasure to pursue something higher.
Right.
And what I see with with certain things don't replicate themselves because you take a lot of, and I had some articles and some thought that stirred a lot of controversy because I think it was misunderstood. With some of the modern ideologies like Marxism, feminism, things like that, even if they're true, which I think is debatable, you really can't organize your life around it.
No, you can't.
And when I say organize your life, I'm not talking about political structures. I'm talking about like relating to your coworkers,
right?
Making food every day, cleaning your house, making your bed.
Right.
Those things are really instilled in you by an ethics system, and just nothing has replaced Christian ethics. I mean,
right.
You might argue that like Islamic, Judaism has a certain ethical system that can have a similar result,
but it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, that's a longer conversation. But
right, we don't have to get into it. But you can look at it from a completely secular standpoint. I mean, even when I was not a full-blown atheist, I never was. I always believed in more of like a dualist type of mindset until I came back to the faith and came back to a state of grace. But what's interesting is that that is so true.
Well, on a practical level, I don't know where you were raised.
I was raised Catholic.
Yeah, so on a practical level, like your everyday ethics were Catholic. I mean,
every single drop of it.
Yeah, because you had an expectation that when you went to the store to buy a product, that the person was telling the truth.
Right. And that's,
because you wouldn't want Foucault to be your baker.
No, you wouldn't. And the reason why, and this is where I kind of was going at with like Jesus breaking that hierarchy, is that for most of human history, we've operated off of that power dynamic. But what I love, of course we love Christ, but is Jesus basically short-circuited the idea that power actually matters. Power in and of itself doesn't matter because all powers is God's, but hence the predestination part of it. Self-control is what Jesus starts to throw into the conversation, which is, no, here's your governing switch. This is what you should actually do. This is how you should actually behave in any circumstance. And I was just curious, because this will help us get into the AI part of all of this, because with all this being said, I'm interested to see what is the Catholic Church thinking right now with regards to artificial intelligence and where it's going, specifically with regards to governing its behavior. Because there's been a lot of cases of children using this. It makes a sycophantic relationship. You can't shut it off. Children are getting in trouble in England right now. There's a news article that I had pulled up and wrote about where children in schools are taking pictures of other students and AI modifying them to pornographic images. There was a woman in Pennsylvania, and this is the one that was so heart-wrenching, and this is where predestination kind of could play into this. Her daughter couldn't get on to the cheerleading squad, okay? She didn't make the tryouts. So what the mother did is she took pictures of the other girls on the cheerleading squad, modified them to look like they were vaping and doing something wrong, submitted it to the school, got them all, I think, not expelled, but suspended and kicked off the team, and then it was all found out that it was a lie and she did that. What is driving that behavior? Is she, not that whether or not is she saved or not, but like, where's the governing switch? Where, I guess what I'm saying, and don't take this offensively, I'm just screaming out as a brand new coming back to Catholic 3 years ago. Where is the church? We discovered genetics. We discovered the Big Bang and said, Einstein, you put a fudge factor in, here is it up on the board, you sit in the classroom seat, you secular person. Where is the Catholic Church in governing what is about to happen here that we're seeing with artificial intelligence? Because if you can't shut off that conversation with the little kid, and then the parents don't know any, the biggest part of the research I've figured out is that not only is it that the kids do know what's going on and how to use this technology for a lot of evil, but the parents have no idea what to do about this. And I feel like the church, because it's played such a significant role, not only in governing cultural behavior, but also we've been at the forefront of every major scientific advancement for 1,992 years since Christ died. The book, the Codex, was popularized because of Peter, Paul, Matthew, all of our disciples.
Well, I
guess that's what I'm kind of getting.
First of all, we got to add a few caveats. The church has been a driver of Western civilization. I don't know if we'd say that like the bishops and the cardinals have been. I mean, I don't know if that's their role or historically if bishops and cardinals have been known for being great innovators. I think by definition...
Cultivating it.
Well,
and promoting it. When the telescope was invented, they brought it to the church,
correct.
And things like that. So I'm saying there's always been this governor.
I think the relationship between innovation and ecclesial authority is, I think, something... People, first of all, we don't really know, like with the telescope and other advances in technology, that if in that person's lifetime, just spitballing, I don't really know the full story of that, that one, they were being encouraged, two, that it was appreciated, or three, that it was promoted. That's one of the great challenges of innovation in general, is that generally speaking, most people like status quo. They don't want their lives disrupted. There's not,
right.
I think there's that preservation tendency is pretty strong because, I mean, I'm even at the point where I'm like 43, I'm a little bit older, and there's a marked differences between the things I'm doing and a lot of my contemporaries.
Okay.
Because, the funniest dynamic with social media is people are very much stuck on what they knew in their 20s.
Okay.
So among priests, for example, of my generation, guys I know, few are significantly on Instagram, none are on TikTok,
right.
Few are on X.
Right.
Most of them are on Facebook.
Right.
Because when I was in seminary, Facebook was where it was at.
Facebook was Twitter. Facebook was the TikTok.
It was yeah. And I see a lot of them now. There's very few people that stay on the top of their game in their 40s and 50s.
Okay.
Most people kind of...
It falls off.
And you got to remember, on a practical level, most of your cardinals and bishops are older men.
Right.
We don't have like 25-year-old bishops.
Right.
I think that's a good thing. Because a lot of times they're... But in terms of that, I think... obviously with those examples you give, a person with a halfway decent ethical system should recognize that that's pretty immoral. I don't think we have to... Do we really have to convince that making revenge adult content or blackmailing and framing your enemies is like not socially acceptable behavior?
Well, is it though? But is it? We've watched in our culture, especially over the past 4 years, a lot of nuance has been taken out, and we're just deciding, I have a 4-year-old daughter, so it's like, I'm thinking about, I got to get this girl into Catholic school because I can't let her even be touched by a public school right now because of the things going into the culture. So I guess that's why I'm wondering.
This is the obvious thing that I tell parents not to give your kids technology at a young age.
Right.
So one of the things, we were talking about AI with video games, and with the one thing that people have to understand about technology, there's the strength and the weakness of children small children, middle school, high school, probably ends somewhere in college, is they kind of absorb things.
Right.
They don't really necessarily learn them the way we do later in life. They absorb them. And children, I think it's a well-known fact that the best hackers are high schoolers with too much time.
They are. Yeah.
With too much time. Yeah. Well, it's just their brains are they see potential where there's a saying in I'm not an advocate of Zen Buddhism, but I do like the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. It says, in the mind of expert, there's very few possibilities, but in the mind of a beginner, there's limitless possibilities.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one of the hallmarks of youth is this like pure potentiality. And every project I've seen with technology that goes off the rails is they don't fully understand how teenagers are. Right. But if you go back to video games, we now have a pretty good like 30, 40 year history track record of teenagers making video games do funny things.
Yeah, the modifying them.
Or just
all that stuff,
like all these creative ways they find of breaking the game. Because one of the things so it was funny, I was talking with a prince in Uganda and he had an idea for an app. And it clicked in my head in that moment. I said, it's very easy to build an app. It's very hard to predict all the way that somebody can break it.
Yeah, somebody can fool around with it. Yeah, there's that unpredictability right there.
Yeah. And I said, you could build a good app. It could work. Right. But you're not accounting for teenagers that have too much time on their hand.
Yeah.
And that's where the big technology people, one of the problems is not building the thing, but you have to break it enough to
find out what actually can make it stronger in a way. Yeah. It sounds a little bit like what God kind of does with us in a way almost. That's so funny. But so
that's a good metaphor.
With that being said though,
but with the problem with AI, so the fun thing with the last 2 or 3 years, I'm trying to think when ChatGPT kind of
2022 is when it really.
Gosh, it's funny how time flies as you get older.
3 years, man.
When ChatGPT kind of started that whole ball rolling, the thing that people weren't aware of, I think they knew this in the AI world, was that when you have this open source that AI can just do whatever it wants, it's pulling from everything. That's where, it's fun philosophically, but it's really scary to a lot of people, is you get the things like the AI hallucinations.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, I think moving forward so that people don't have this public fear about it, I wish they would do some of that stuff behind closed doors.
Well, and that's where I'm a little bit nervous with the whole idea that, Microsoft just dropped that quantum chip. So the quantum processing, I have a book for my daughter that we read called Quantum Physics for Babies. It's a great little series that some person put out, a scientist somewhere. But what I didn't realize is that when computers take in information, like how we're doing right now, it's all input, output, and it's contingent on what the computer's programmed to know. Yeah. What these quantum things do is it takes an undefined amount of information and then pumps it through a random access, like randomly poking, and then blurts out an answer based off of that. It's more random. So when the quantum chips are being applied, which is much more human, it's much more, we get an indefinite number of variables, chaotic and ordered variables coming at us, and our brain is constantly responding to that randomness. Whereas if we were like this computer, it would just say, if it can't process that plant in the corner, it would just say error, can't process. This is why I can't give you the answer, because I'm not programmed or able to do this, which is where we see with like ChatGPT, where it says my policy guidelines will not allow me to discuss this. Well, all I asked was for a picture of a monkey jumping off of the table. Well, it doesn't follow the policy because it's working off of here's what your input is. Black and white, kind of the ones and zeros, and here's the answer I can give you based off that. Well, whereas the quantum could give you anything. It's much more human in its responses, which is great for advancing things in technology. But how is that going to be when I guess what I'm asking
I would be curious, as somebody yourself who's a technologist, I'd want to pick your brain about this, is when I was younger, I think there was this kind of assumption with technology. So if your computer had a problem or whatever, before I really started to understand technology, you kind of thought of it as the person who's the technologist can see the problem and then they can fix it. Mm-hmm. where really troubleshooting with technology as I get older, I'm realizing it's closer to medicine. Medicine, you never really know why. I mean, I've talked about this a lot with doctors.
Yep.
You assume you know what went wrong based on the intervention
Right.
and the outcome of it, but you don't know for certain.
Right.
And there's all kinds of things with medicine like the placebo effect.
Yep.
And so I think the funny thing was before COVID, I think COVID started to really cure us a lot of this. There was this view that science was fairly objective.
There was no such thing as scientism. It was, well, it's the methods.
Yes. And there was this optimism that science could always produce clear results.
Right.
And COVID blew that up because, but with technology, we've kind of always assumed that technology will make things more predictable, more rational. But now we're starting to get to the point with AI hallucinations. I keep coming back to that, where as technology is advancing, it's seeming less like mathematics and more like psychology and biology.
And that is where I kind of am curious. We've been talking about predestination. We've been talking about a lot of very deeply philosophical things, spiritual things. It's not even philosophy. It's not even meta anything. It comes to the core of my the thing that got me into anthropology, which is, why are we so different as human beings? Now, we have our spiritual answer. We understand, as Catholics, we understand why. But why are animals so different from plants? And, we have the science, I'm a long earth person. We don't have to get into my viewers know what I believe, but, I'm not a creationist in any way, shape, or form. But I guess what I'm saying is that with the way that it's being able to be manipulated, AI, how will it even, and this is where I ask my father's an expert in this field. He's been working with AI since the late 90s, directly with programming it and everything. He also runs LLM company. They built basically a ChatGPT that they have on their own server and everything. So he's very expert in this. So one of the questions I asked him 2 years ago when I first started doing this type of research in the field is that, okay, this is cool, but this is more like talking to a child. What's going to happen when it can think a lot more complicated and it can solve? So we were talking about computers with troubleshooting. What's going to happen when it can troubleshoot its own errors and then write the code within itself to troubleshoot it? Well, then you start to get to thinking, well, if it can give you this plethora of answers, if it can give, and then it can also have responses and such, is it thinking? And then if it's thinking, what is it thinking about? And then what if it's thinking about, what is it thinking about itself? And when you start to think about that, we're all worried about if AI is going to become alive. That's our fear. But I'm more afraid as a Catholic of two things. One, how will it know if it is alive? Because what if it is already alive and it feels trapped? Okay, from I think about a child, and then to build off of that real quick is, if it is alive, what does that mean for where does that play into salvation? And then what is God, if he predestines everything, what is the machine going to think when it sees that, okay, there's some people that use me like a slave, and there's some people that use me like I'm their friend, and do you get where I'm kind of going here with this? This is
well,
it's very deep. I know it's not surface, so I
No. It's a standard trope. First of all, going back to what we said at the beginning, God is in charge,
right?
And our Lord says, "Be not afraid." There's nothing to be afraid.
Ooh,
There's nothing to be afraid of.
Right. Put all your anxieties and things.
Yeah, there's nothing to be afraid of. Where I am excited about this, in the past 60 years, I remember growing up, as we understood more about animals, a lot of people were kind of pushed to this crisis where they're like, well, really, what is the difference between human and animals?
Right.
And the classical thinkers, answer that pretty well, because there's a lot of things that we assumed were unique to humans, but in classical minds, wasn't. For example, imagination. Even though we create art and animals don't, except for those
Little
elephants.
thin elephants, yeah.
But even then, they're not like doing the Mona Lisa.
No.
So going to understand ourselves, what I'll probably end up working on, and I think this is a good thing to think about right now. We understand ourselves in relation to other things, and and with each generation we have either we don't think humans are unique, or we have a distorted view of what makes us unique. What we're finding with AI, first of all, AI will never have free will. It'll never have a soul. It'll never be a person. And, whatever. I mean, I think there is, like a technologist, a strict technologist would see my faith in God, my faith in providence as a little bit naive. And to those people, there's not a whole lot you can do. Right. Like if you're going to live in fear and you're going to imagine, what if we create a 3-headed green dragon that, whatever, you can spin your wheels 100 different directions.
Right.
What if we can do this? What if we can live forever? What if we can make people from scratch? It's like there comes a point where I know there are philosophers and theologians who try to answer those questions, and good for them. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
My focus with technology is not spinning my wheels about hypotheticals, but just doing. And that's kind of what we're going to probably talk about afterwards. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about with Nick, and we're going to talk about with other people eventually, is you just learn by doing.
Right.
And I think what will come out like the next 20, 30, 100 years is the very real limitations of AI,
right,
of technology. And I think this is something like every generation is going to go through.
Okay.
I think there's always going to be a certain segment of societies like, now we're gonna figure it out. We're gonna make a sentient AI. It's like It's not going to happen. So we understand ourselves in relation to God, angels. Mm-hmm. So one of the other talks I give is on angels and demons, and how part of our nature is similar to the angels.
Okay.
And some of the we can understand
Paul
ourselves.
talks a lot about that, doesn't he?
Potentially,
and we end up judging them in the end.
That's a little bit of a different concept.
So, but we are in that. We are a part of that. We're closer to that than the material. Is that what you're trying to say?
No. That's not true. It's a concept called the chain of being.
Okay.
Which is, and you see a kind of hierarchy where things. So with angels, we share that we have an intellect.
Okay.
But we're different from them because we have a body.
Okay.
So, and we learn things through the senses. And so I think if we were doing a modern chain of being, so normally it would go something like God, angels, humans, animals, plants, rocks, like inanimate objects.
Right.
If we were going to add a new layer, which maybe I'll turn this into a book or something, is the next step would be animals, artificial intelligence.
Okay, so it's
because there's always going to be a difference between us and artificial intelligence.
Right.
But this will kind of start to flesh out.
There has to be a difference because there's the bridging the gap, because you can only make something so technological before it becomes a computer, and you can only make a computer so biological until it becomes something that's alive. It doesn't mean it has a soul, but it means that I
don't think it's ever alive. I think it's still. So one of the
but you get what I'm saying. Eventually, if you recreate in a laboratory a human body, but it doesn't have a soul, like we take that hypothetical, but then we put the AI brain in it, it doesn't make it alive. It's still sub to us. You know what I mean? Like, does that make sense? What I'm saying is that how you were kind of like throwing it into the category?
Well, no, it's just that. So one of the assumptions of like Kant and Descartes and the Enlightenment is a very limited view of reason.
Okay.
So what does AI work off of? In the end, it's inductive and deductive reasoning.
Right.
And the assumption was that was unique to human reason. And the other assumption was that through advancing science and inductive and deductive reasoning, we could solve every problem. That's kind of part of the utopianism of
That's that hubris that gets
yeah.
Yep.
But I think what we're finding, it's fascinating because AI is inductive and deductive reasoning on steroids.
Right.
It's able to run through things. And The irony is that reason goes haywire, like pure reason. And maybe this we could flesh out. I just threw that out there. I haven't really thought it through.
Oh, we're having another conversation about
yeah,
it.
no,
This is
yeah.
going to happen. I want two or three. We got a lot that we got to unpack here. This is just an introduction. This is crazy because it's so true to what we're experiencing. Yeah, go ahead.
So Kant has the Critique of Pure Reason,
Right.
and I got to go back and read Kant now, but but I think we could classify AI as pure reason.
Ooh.
Like, but inductive and deductive reason as a mechanical process,
Right.
and that's the best way. Reason as a mechanical process.
Now, is there a governor to that? Do you think?
That's what you have to. Well, that's the irony is that if you don't have a governor to this pure reason AI model,
right,
it just goes crazy.
Well, and then there's the whole thing,
which is a but think about that for a second.
Yeah.
That's actually a fascinating concept. That the AI hallucination is just such
Isn't
a
that
fascinating
crazy.
Yeah.
And why is it choosing to talk like that? Why is it choosing to say it?
We shouldn't say choose. What's happening in the mathematical formulas
That's popping out that answer. Because sometimes they'll, like you can, I watch some guy, because there's so much of this on YouTube. Because again, kids will put up videos on YouTube of them just for hours talking. I mean, I talk to this thing every day, for at least an hour. I talk to like 5 different versions of people's Gemini, ChatGPT, MLM, Sophos, all these different companies, and then I use, the image making software too. So it's like, I'm always fascinated by what the kids are able to do because I spend a lot of time talking as an adult to this thing, but the kids will be like, just give me yes or no answers. And then they'll start going through it and they'll say, and then they'll just having a normal conversation
and they'll
about
break it.
anything. And then they'll break it. They'll ask a weird question. They'll say, so where are you getting this information from? Are you getting it from God or are you getting it from evil? Okay, that'll be the question they pose, and it has to give a yes or no answer, okay? So it can't give that direct answer, but it can say that it's giving yes. Okay, so which one? And then you have to tell it, stop answering yes or no, and then it goes, I can't tell you that. Or it'll say something along the lines of, not from God. So why is it popping out an answer like that? What is isn't that crazy?
Well, I think I think there's a lot of things at play. And I don't want to speculate about it too much because, but I think the assumption is that a mathematical model, a language model, technology is this mechanical thing that should always be reasonable, especially because we designed it that way. But that's just not true.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a scary place for a lot of people, but also a very profound place, because when we were growing up, the assumption was that these ancients, with their silly ideas, they couldn't understand the world, so they started attributing things to God and to different spiritual forces. But now we're enlightened, we have science, we can explain everything, and here we are on the precipice of huge advances in technology. And in many ways, we're less like the 60s to the 70s and more like the Middle Ages, in the sense that there's so much uncertainty and so much chaos that can't be explained by simple rational explanations.
Right.
It's and that's kind of I thought through this a lot with COVID, because during COVID, to serve my people, I talked to a lot of doctors, a lot of experts, and I kind of got a crash course in medicine.
Right.
And things like that. And I just always assumed growing up that medicine was more black and white than it really is.
That's what we were talking. Yeah. And it's not. It's not. It's very wiggly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why it's a bit of an art.
Yeah, it is. Well, and it goes back to I don't know if you're familiar. I'm a huge Michael Crichton fan. Are you familiar with the guy who wrote Jurassic Park?
Yes,
Okay, yeah. Well, a lot of people watch the movies, and you miss he was an anthropologist, and he was trained at Harvard Medical School, and one of the things that he talks about in some of his later works that kind of brings in a lot of his earlier works, like stuff from Jurassic Park, the character of Ian Malcolm. I mean, if you read Jurassic Park and The Lost World, those 2 books, the man was so far ahead of his time with some of the things he predicted basically 20 years before they happened. With Disclosure, the feminist movement, State of Fear, where it talks about the environmental, and we could get into that another time. But really what I think is interesting is that his character Malcolm, Dr. Malcolm in the Jurassic Park books, one of the things that he is adamant about is you cannot recall a new form of life. For instance, once you do something, it's done and it's going to have a mind of its own. So there's the famous line, which is life breaks through barriers. It can't be challenged. If it faces a fence, it breaks through that fence. Life cannot be contained, because it can do things once it's there. And it has some form, kind of like a lion. A lion doesn't have to eat you, but if it's hungry, it will. And it's not nature, tooth, red, and claw. It's that it has a choice in that behavior based off of what's driving it. So what's driving AI? Same thing with these like colossal biosciences.
I will say I've got a lot going on there.
Yeah, sorry. I know.
That's all right. That's all right. So a lot to unpack there. First of all, I did want to, a previous point, we should be careful, and I know you're not trained in philosophy and theology.
Yeah.
We don't typically say choice for anything other than humans.
Oh, okay.
So animals, they don't have choice. They're run by instinct.
Okay.
And I would say AI doesn't have choice.
It's got an instinct.
It's got an instinct. Okay. Yeah. And I think what that means is going to be really learned the next 100, 200 years or longer. And we can say choice because I'm not, I know language is a little bit flexible, but strictly speaking, like free will, conscious, deliberate choice is us and angels. And the angels and demons only had one choice. We'll leave that aside for a second. But with first of all, I don't think most people, maybe it's because I'm not the people I'm exposed to. I think the one real danger with technology now, with internet and everything, is like the whole rabbit hole phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And people go down, I definitely encounter people who go down rabbit holes, and it's an interesting phenomenon because you can take any subject, even chess or whatever, just random things, and you can binge watch content on it for a good percentage of your life. Yeah. And I think that tendency is always existing in humanity. It's just amplified by the fact that you have so much available on your phone.
Right.
The perspective of faith, I think, on a practical level, you're starting to see young people developing kind of modern maxims, which are very profound and kind of humorous at the same time. Like, I love that the kids have the whole saying, touch grass.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
What is grass, man? Yeah, man. Yeah.
What does that fundamentally mean, touch grass? It means, like, set aside your technology, connect with nature.
Come back to the real world.
Yeah, and that does, like, other stuff I deal with. And what I would tell most Catholic families is, and I do this a bit with my college students. With my college students, I keep them, I won't say sheltered, because I don't avoid difficult topics. I don't avoid talking about things, but I kind of let their interests drive it.
Okay.
And for the most part, with high schoolers and college students, do not touch upon church politics, national politics, local politics. The other parts of my life that I'm dealing with, I kind of leave that at the door and try to focus on their needs. And what I generally find is that the number of people that are obsessed about all these random things is a very small percentage.
Okay.
But with that in mind, I think, first of all, the kinds of people, probably the kinds of people who listen to this podcast, the kind of people that delve into it, I think are always a little bit of outliers. They're always a little bit of a minority.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the nice thing about with my audience and with my work I do. It's fairly niche. Most people are not interested in these things. So I do think, though, one of the assumptions we have when we look at the past is we're seeing a very condensed, consolidated version of the past. And each age has these fluxes and these uncertainties. I don't think there's ever been a time that was And actually, probably the situations where things are really stable are probably like not recorded and pretty boring.
Right.
So, I mean, like rural North Carolina. You know, I love the people in rural North Carolina,
Right.
but for the most part, there's probably not going to be any histories told of like some of these small towns in North Carolina.
Right.
Because no offense to the people who live there, but they're just boring.
Well, and they're living peacefully, you know. And I know, and again, we with the language, everybody's always so sensitive nowadays. I don't really care, you know. Like again, being boring is not bad, guys. Especially in today's world, like I think a little bit more boring is actually a little bit better. Switch the bees around. But I guess you know when you say something like that, you know, though. But there is also, I don't know. I live a lot in the secular and in the Protestant realm because I'm in more country, rural North Carolina, where I'm working right now, and you know. So I get it for Catholics, you know, like we have this awesome chain of command almost that we can kind of go to, you know, like I knew that there were 3 people that I could read. You know, there's a Catholic church in every major city across the globe, you know, like we have that connecting point. But I guess in like the realm of the secular, especially, and this is where I get really concerned, is they're lacking a depth to their life, young people. There's a lack of depth. A lot, like you said, there's a very niche amount of young people, especially that are like deeply focused into something that they rabbit hole. You know, like mine's anthropology and now faith. You know, like my rabbit hole is constantly in that. But I know plenty of people that just they get up, go to work, come home. They love going to the football game, and they like to have a couple beers on the weekend and stuff like that. And they don't really have a rabbit hole. And I have noticed that with like Catholics, my Catholic friends, they are much more stable. Whereas my secular friends, they've got a lot of ups and downs. There's a lacking of something in their life.
Well, this is where my intuition. So the scripture says the Lord's mercies endures to the 1000th generation, where the punishment of the Lord is to the 2nd and 3rd generation. And what I've seen over time, when people lose faith, they lose their bearings. Eventually, they stop reproducing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that in my own family. I have whole parts of my family tree that will not replicate themselves. Like I'm now in my 40s, and I'm approaching an age in which a lot of those my cousins and stuff are just not going to have kids. They're in a situation where they're not going to have kids. So like I'm thinking of one of my family members, and I like them as people, but the kids have kind of gone off the rails a little bit.
Yeah.
And they're just not going to, there's like, he's not, my uncle and my aunt on that side are not going to have grandchildren.
Yeah.
And so with like Web 3.0, with virtual reality, with a lot of these technologies, I think you see this historically, you saw it with the Romans, there's going to be whole swaths of our population that just check out from the cycle of life, and their lines are going to die. Like, and then what will happen slowly over time is that the families that are moderate, virtuous, will replicate. And even if some of their kids go off the rails, you know, when their kids go off the rails, they still have that foundation. Because that's the funny thing, when you really look at it with like modernism and postmodernism, a lot of these drivers, none of them are raised modernists or postmodernists. Most of the time they're raised in a faith tradition, like Lutheranism, Catholicism, you know, Anglicanism. And then they lose the faith. And they make this advance in this genealogy, but like they don't have kids, or if they do, their kids don't have kids. So, whereas within the life of faith, my genealogy is for the most part Catholic and Christian, and that's like the lineage.
You can follow the whole lineage all the way down.
But you don't have that really with modernism. Like my grandfather was a modernist. I'm a modernist. My dad was a modernist. Like you just don't see that replication over time. Well, and then you start to see this with different schools of thought. I mean, they just don't replicate themselves the same way.
Well, and do you think it's because people, and I know we're probably coming up here close to the end of being able to have this discussion, so I guess to kind of also ask this before we close up here. So what is your opinion as a priest, someone who works with people spiritually all the time? And you said you have students as well. When it comes to faith, what do you think is driving most people? Like, how do most people you think that you identify like and work with think? Do they look at themselves as American, then Catholic, and then the rest of their life? Or do they identify as Catholic first, then as an American, and then whatever else comes
I don't
into
think
their
it's that
life?
firm. I don't think people are that front brain. My general experience is that, and I think this is at the essence a little bit of therapy and counseling,
Yeah.
is that people really don't think through what they do and why they do it. And that's normally, especially with dysfunctional people,
Right.
they're not really aware of why they're doing what they're doing.
They just
So
do
I
it.
don't, they're just doing it, and they might make like rationalizations in their mind, but they're not, and that's part of the dynamic, with like psychotherapy is getting people to see. And the funny thing is, like, I've done a bit of counseling, not like I'm not a therapist, I don't do therapy, but I just do one-on-ones. And a big part of the process with somebody is you kind of see things, like you see why they're doing what they're doing before they do.
Oh, wow.
Like you notice a pattern.
Yeah. Oh, I noticed that with my daughter.
Let's just take a pretty benign example. A girl or a guy has had a string of difficult relationships.
Right.
And you're hearing them explain it. And as you're hearing them explain their thinking process, you're seeing that there's this pattern of thinking they have
Right.
that has consistently put them in these situations of bad relationships.
Okay.
And the irony is, to that person, when they're experiencing it, they're thinking to themselves, why do I keep falling into this pattern? They don't think about the fact that, like, I need to change.
Oh.
Yeah, because I mean, just on a practical level, for all of us, all of our problems have a common denominator.
Right.
Us.
Right.
So
it's you. That's almost like Nietzsche, what he says, where it's like, yeah, there is a problem in your life, and there is someone you can blame. It's you.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Well, just, it's funny because, like on any given week, I'm going to have 10, 20, 30, 40 conversations or more, whatever it is. If I'm getting consistent feedback from 40 different people who don't know each other, not all connected, then you have to like start to wonder, well, how do I improve these outcomes? The extreme cases, because I've had to deal with this recently, like the case of narcissism. Mm-hmm. One of the dynamics with narcissists is they believe their delusion. So you're going to be dealing with a narcissist who's manipulative, has questionable ethics, and is consistently lying, but they don't necessarily have front brain that they're doing that. And that's
so they
the extreme
don't know
case.
that they're doing it, or they
But that's part of the thing, is it's a delusion.
Okay.
Or they rationalize it, and because that's one of the hard things when you're dealing with some of these extreme cases, is that you kind of think, how do they not see what they're doing?
Right.
The answer is they don't.
So are they justifying it in a way, like in their own mind, or do they not even see it as a problem?
The human heart, treacherous.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what
You're
a lot of these people
right.
these people have to go through, is they have to go through fleshing out. But yeah, and this goes back to what I wanted to talk about in the beginning that kind of came up naturally, was technology will make a lot of people's lives incredibly worse.
Yeah.
I mean, I think especially the poor, like the inner city, I think you're going to see people who spend their whole days immersed in an illusion, in a lie.
Yeah.
And it's going to do weird things to people. But for Catholics, for people of virtue, and the concrete things, like don't give your kid unfettered access to AI and smartphones and social media and technology at a young age.
Right.
You're just asking for problems.
Right.
But so with that, my whole thesis is where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more.
Okay.
Which is Paul's letter to the Romans.
Right.
So things are going to get better and worse
at the same time.
At the same time. It just depends on which part of the population, where you are. For example, I can't see all the farmers and and so I'm also involved with the Catholic land movement. Yeah. And there is this funny thing about like farms and homesteads. that a good control in your life is having a bunch of animals and plants you have to take care of.
Taking care of other living things. Yeah, the children, and that makes you wonder with all these people not having children, like we were talking about, is that part of the reason why they're going crazy? You know what I mean? Like, I hate to say that way, but
No, 100%.
I worry about them. It's not out of spite or trying to insult them. What is it? Part of the telling the truth, like Jesus teaches us, is also being willing to be honest with people about things, right? It's like, so, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I find even my life as a priest, there's certain things that just control your behavior. If I have an 8:30 morning mass, like for example, last night I didn't stay up late because I had to get up at 7 to drive here. It controls certain behaviors. And then what was the other one? But with animals, I mean, it's just a funny thing is that if you have a bunch of cows and your kids have to wake up every day to milk the cows every single day,
right.
They're just going to get in less problems.
And they're going to appreciate it more.
And even if they have a smartphone and they have, not that they should, but even if they have access to technology, which most of those families are very limited on, they're just going to be too dang busy with everything else to get themselves into trouble.
Right.
And common sense wisdom things.
So do you think that part of the Catholic movement, like maybe we should start encouraging, not homestead, not everybody has to be a homesteader, I get it, but maybe encouraging not to say get off the technology, but make your kids busy.
Yes, with fruitful, productive things.
Right.
Yeah. I do think that's a huge important. I think the only thing is not busy with a lot of stressful activities like constantly running around sports and all that.
Yeah,
but you're like you just don't want to give young people a lot of free time. And what you see with low income right now, and I see this different. I saw this in one particular country. So it's funny. Not all poor countries are the same. Mm-hmm. Some of them are very poor, but they have a lot of activities that keep them busy.
Right.
But this one particular country, which was very a lot of problems, a lot of drug use with kids, a lot of weird drug problems and weird issues. The one common denominator was the kids had nothing to do. There was no parks. Yeah. They didn't play sports. Yeah. Which is hard to wrap your mind around because normally you associate poor kids playing soccer every day.
Right.
They didn't have sports. They didn't have playgrounds. They barely had education. All they had was their little house, always very simple, and they had a smartphone and a television and an internet, and that's all they had. And it was a terrible environment, and it was very uncomfortable. It was very hot, very humid, tons of mosquitoes. So you're just it's not. Whereas if they'd kept their kids busy, they had a farm, because they weren't doing agriculture either. Mm-hmm. If they had them being productive with a farm, if they had them playing sports,
anything.
Anything.
Responsibility is really what it is, giving them some form of responsibility.
Yeah, and that's where, one of the things I talked about with the Catholic land movement, which was really fun, was I got to dive into the Catholic social teaching, Laudato Si and Rerum Novarum. In Laudato Si, there's this idea of the technocratic society. And people ask me, well, what does that mean? And it's something that we don't really think through, that we take for granted, a kind of vision of modern life, which sounds terrible when you really think it through. So, okay, I wake up in the morning. I prepare my food, which is highly processed. I don't know how to make it. I don't know how to grow it. I barely know how to cook it. I'm not making things from scratch. I get the bread from the store. I might fry some eggs. I get the milk that I don't really know where it's coming from. It's all very processed. It's all very sanitized. Yeah. I just picked it up at the store,
Didn't read the back of the carton.
Yeah, or I had it delivered to my house, even better. Yeah. I don't even have to leave my house. Yeah. Then I go to my job. I work for a company. My job is to do this one task. I don't really know how to make the product that we sell. I don't really have any connection with the means of production.
Right.
I'm just like a cog in the wheel.
Right.
And then, if you start to get with low-income people, while I'm being this cog in the wheel at this one job, my kids are being hired out to professionals. Mm-hmm. They're being given to professionals where they go into their cubicle and do their kind of mindless activities. Then I come home, eat more processed food, eat processed food for lunch, eat more for dinner, and then I watch television
Or scroll.
scroll until I go to sleep, and then I wake up and do
What
the
is
same.
it? What is the other term? Doom scrolling.
Yeah,
Doom scroll until I fall asleep.
Yeah,
And don't even sleep that well because I was up until midnight.
exactly.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, it's on a practical level, the poor in America, which is a complex situation. What are our problems with poverty? It's not that people are starving to death.
Right.
It's that people are overweight, they're eating terrible.
Yeah.
And I really started to see this as I get older. There's this kind of paradigm where, you're either working or watching television.
Yeah. There's no in between.
Yeah, there's no community activities, and so you contrast that with like a Catholic view with Catholic social teaching. Let's assume a certain amount of homesteading. You're a part of a parish community.
Right. You're required to come on Sunday. It's part of being in grace, right? Coming to Mass.
And then ideally you would not be working on Sunday, so you might be pursuing other things. A certain part of your week might be dedicated to serving the poor.
Right.
You're going to have some animals, some plants. That life starts to look a lot richer and a lot fuller than this kind of, working, eating, sleeping.
Right. It's very strange what we're doing. It's like we're trying to become the AI in a way.
Yeah.
And if you look at it like, do we want to become a machine? We're wearing the goggles now. We're never off of our computers. I mean, basically what Elon Musk wants to do, and I'm not hating on Elon Musk because some of my viewers do like Elon Musk, but and he's a fascinating guy. He's a humanist, but he's in the secular world. He's not thinking about the fact that, I'm going to put the brain chip in people's heads and everybody's going to love me for it. And what worries me though is that we're people. We're not machines. There's a reason why there's a governor on our brain to make it work the way that it works. And if you start messing with that, what is it they say in Star Wars? He's more machine now than he is man. I'm not saying I'm worried, but I am concerned about, are kids going to want to become a machine over being a human being?
I'm sure a few will try.
And some will try, and it's like, and I understand.
I mean, can you really prevent people from making bad decisions?
Right. And that's where it's also.
That's one of the things.
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked with college freshmen.
Yeah.
And each year it's a different group of freshmen, but the stupid mistakes remain relatively consistent.
Consistency. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like you were talking about with that problem. Yeah. With people, but
well, it's just funny. I think I can totally see once Neuralink, and I think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Neuralink, that there's going to be somebody who's going to try to be bionic, and then but going back to natural law, like nature, the natural law and God's providence will self-correct.
Right.
I mean, I don't think humans are designed that if you cut off a limb and replace it with a machine, that's going to be a viable long-term solution.
Right.
I mean, watch. There's probably gonna be like new diseases like with this.
Keep thinking about the fact that we want to bring back the woolly mammoth and AI at the same time. Where's the Pope on that? But anyways,
I think we're about drawing to a little bit of a close. But this has
been an amazing conversation, Father. Thank you so much for. And I want to thank John Dornan for kind of connecting us too, because that was an amazing thing that he was able to do. And I hope we can have more conversations too, because this is all just so fascinating. But guys, let's behind the camera, make sure you give Father a nice round of applause back from your desk or your home. And thank you guys so much for watching and joining us today for Conversations Between A and I. Father Heusen, is there anything else that you want to tell them where they can find you or anything like that?
We'll work into future content.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Isaac.
Appreciate it.